Then I'm going to connect us to YouTube Live. Okay, we should be live on, yeah, we are live. So Sarah, you can go ahead and share it.
And Courtney's doing it.
Okay, Courtney can go ahead and share it. Okay, we are good to go. Hold on real quick. One second. I'm gonna go ahead. 1 second, sorry. Okay. Wait a few minutes for everyone to get in. I'm gonna go ahead. Okay, we have 14 viewers so far.
Well, with 14, that's certainly a party.
Thank you for everyone who's joining. We're going to be beginning our program here in just a minute. We're just letting everyone go ahead and get on. The numbers are rising. I think we'll go ahead and get started at 5:35. Is that okay with everyone?
Sure.
Okay.
You give us the high sign. We'll just stay here and look pretty until it's time to go.
Okay.
Reminds me of my days back working with Edward R. Murrow during the London Blitz.
This
Actually, no, that
Virginia.
wasn't. That was Walter Cronkite. Okay.
Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. Would you like me to leave this screen up, Scott, while you're talking?
Yes, please. That's right.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Well, greetings to everyone who is joining us today on Facebook Live for Discovering a President. We're very happy to have you with us. We ask your patience in dealing with the technological environment that we're working in, although a lot of preparation has gone into trying to bring you a great program today. So we appreciate you taking part in it. Today's program is a collaboration between three entities that are focused on interpreting the life and times of James Monroe, soldier, statesman, diplomat, and fifth president of the United States. Through our respective missions and partnerships such as this, we strive to present a comprehensive and balanced appraisal of Monroe's place in history and the major issues that characterize his public career. We also examine the personal lives of Monroe and his family. James Monroe's Highland, located in Albemarle County, Virginia, was the family's home from 1799 to 1823. Administered by the College of William and Mary, Highland in recent years has applied rigorous scholarship and archaeological investigation to uncovering the remains of the original house that was destroyed by fire in the mid-1800s. Another significant part of Highland's story is the legacy of generations of enslaved African Americans who lived and labored there, forming part of Monroe's public and private ties to slavery. The James Monroe Museum in Fredericksburg, Virginia, is the nation's largest collection of artifacts and archives dedicated to Monroe and his family. The museum, which was founded by Monroe descendants on the site of his law office from the 1780s, is today administered by the University of Mary Washington. The museum works closely with historic preservation and museum studies students at UMW to utilize the collections to help train future museum professionals. Students working with the museum and the Papers of James Monroe developed two traveling exhibits detailing Monroe's presidential tours of 1817 and 1819, which were seen by people in 15 states throughout the northern and southern sections of the country. The Papers of James Monroe is a documentary editing project that began at the College of William and Mary in 1989 and has been located at the University of Mary Washington since 1999. Its goal is to publish a 10-volume series of annotated documents related to the public career and private life of Monroe. Volume 7, covering his tenure as Secretary of State and his election to the presidency, appeared earlier this year. Publication of Volume 8 is scheduled for 2022. We're joined by representatives of each of these entities today who will be interviewing our special guest, author Tim McGrath. Sara Bon-Harper is Executive Director of James Monroe's Highland. The research that she directs there has recently, as we noted, uncovered Highland's main house and opened a new chapter of site interpretation with inclusive narratives and descendant engagement. Ms. Bon-Harper earned a PhD in anthropology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and a bachelor's degree in anthropology and classics from the University of Arizona. She has taught and conducted research in Europe and in North America. Dan Preston has edited the Papers of James Monroe since the project's inception in 1989, first at William and Mary, and then for the last 2 decades at the University of Mary Washington. In addition to his work with the Monroe Papers, he is co-editor of the Papers of the American sculptor Daniel Chester French. He received a BA in history from Evergreen State College and MA and PhD degrees from the University of Maryland College Park. Dan has held a Mellon Fellowship at the Virginia Historical Society and a David Bruce Fellowship at Keele University in Staffordshire, England. And I am Executive Director of the University of Mary Washington Museums, and before that was Director of the university's James Monroe Museum. Among my prior positions are Director of the Virginia Museum of the Civil War, Director of Historic Resources for the City of Manassas, Virginia, and Curator of the Manassas Museum. I received a BA in History and Historic Preservation from the University of Mary Washington, back when it was Mary Washington College, and an MA in History and Museum Administration from William and Mary. I'm also proud to be an editorial advisor for White House History Quarterly, the journal of the White House Historical Association. And now to the guy who's the one who brought us all together today for this program. Tim McGrath is a recipient of the Samuel Eliot Morrison Award for Naval Literature and 2-time winner of the Commodore John Barry Book Award, as well as author of the critically acclaimed biography, John Barry, An American Hero in the Age of Sail, and Give Me a Fast Ship, the Continental Navy and America's Revolution at Sea. Tim lives outside Philadelphia with his wife, Sid, although today he is coming to us from the Jersey Shore, and I know we're all envious of him being out there. And we're all very excited about his new biography, James Monroe, A Life. So what we're going to do is have the panel ask a series of questions. And as you on Facebook Live want to note your questions, we will be dealing with those at the end, although we'll be taking notes of them as they come along. But we do want to go ahead and start with questions from our panel. Also want to remind you that at the end, we will show some information about how you can order this new biography. You've got choice from either Highland or the James Monroe Museum, or both if you would like. And those proceeds will help benefit the activities of our museums. But we'll get started with our questions, and the first will come from Dan Preston.
Well, Tim, we'll start with the obvious. Why Monroe? Why did you choose the topic of James Monroe for your book?
Well, thanks, Dan, and a special thanks to Scott and Sarah and Lindsay Crawford, who's helped put this project together. I do have to say, talking about James Monroe to the 3 of you, and I'm showing my age, I feel like somebody pitching to Sandy Koufax, Bob Gibson, and Juan Marichal. But it's a pleasure to be here. And I want to say right off the bat that this book wouldn't be in print if it weren't for the wonderful help I got from the 3 of you and the marvelous staff at each of your entities. Why Monroe? Our editor, Brent Howard at Penguin, is a young kid, 41, a year older than my son. And after Give Me a Fast Ship, he said, let's think of a bigger project, something, a little bit weightier. So he said, pick someone, let's do a biography, pick somebody you'd like to do. And I thought of another Virginian, George C. Marshall, who was one of my dad's heroes. And Brent kind of winced and said, I'm editing a book on him right now. And he suggested Harry Truman, to which I said, doing a book on Harry Truman after David McCullough certainly sounds like an interesting challenge. But after a couple of days thinking, okay, we might be able to do like a 400-page book on Harry Truman. He then got back to me and said that one of the Truman scholars in Missouri had just signed a contract to do a book, but he goes, let's pick another president. I immediately said James Monroe, and he said, why? And I said, because when I was a 7 or 8-year-old kid, he was my favorite president. I had been to Valley Forge. and the ranger there, given the tour, had said that Monroe had been there. He'd been wounded as a teenage lieutenant the year before at Trenton, and there was this kid's book on James Monroe, and off we went. And as a history major undergrad in college, I thought I had a good grasp of him and what he'd accomplished, and I had not a scintilla of what I was in for. The depth and breadth of this man's life and the events and policies that he either was involved with or led just took your breath away. Penguin asked for a 400-page book, and I gave him a first draft of 1,300 pages, which I got down to 900, and then Brent got down to the present-day book. But that's why, in the last 6 years, has been just a joy getting to know more about him, and to be honest with you, his rather remarkable wife.
Well, if I think I get to ask the follow-up to that, and it's such a joy to talk to you here and to be in this company. And Tim, just kudos on the work. It's just a delight. Monroe had a long career in public service, and you approached that from two different scales. Okay, you did that long sweep through U.S. history in the arc of a lifetime, and you did it on the very individual, detailed, day-to-day, the conversation, the individual characters and their backstories. I really am struck by your approach to history, really, simultaneously from these two different scales, both from the granular day-to-day and from this great swath through Monroe's long career, which was a big chunk of early U.S. history. I would just like to hear a little bit about the choices that you made and how you came with that approach, both to do that very intimate personal history and the long swath.
Well, that's a good question, Sarah, and thank you. And again, thank you for all your assistance with questions day and night, same with Dan and with Scott and again, your teams. I think the thing that made it so interesting for me about Monroe is that his private life is its own story. It's I wouldn't call it a soap opera, but it certainly has its interesting, as you three know, twists and turns. The arc of the story was pretty laid out and remarkable, and you're just trying to get it to gel and tell how this teenager from William and Mary becomes a lieutenant in the Continental Army, how he leads the skirmish line with Captain William Washington, crossing the Delaware hours before Washington, and on a ride that takes him circumvented across the Atlantic Ocean and through diplomatic and international and domestic policies and events. But the thing that also I found so interesting with him was his family and his the people that he's met and the intricate little issues and things. I'm a sucker for a good story, and Monroe's is wonderful. But it's neat to stop at times and get a pick for what he did or what happened. One of my favorite ones where you get into you can still be you're not in the weeds, but you're able to tell a convincing little bit of it, is while he's the minister in France under George Washington. And he has an idea that John Jay in London at the same time is working up a treaty that the English are going to have undue influence on. And at the same time, the French are not going to like. And there's an issue, there's one point where John Trumbull, who everybody will know is the painter of the magnificent paintings at the Capitol that are so famous, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, surrender at Yorktown. He is Jay's secretary, and he comes over to Paris and tells Monroe, Jay would not give me a copy of this treaty to have you, for you to have. But then at the same time, he says, I have memorized it and I will be glad to recite it to you. And Monroe goes, no, don't do that because I'm not going to remember it or anything like that. And Trumbull, oh. But Trumbull's kind of upset because he really wants to recite. He's practiced on this like a school kid doing Casey at the Bat. And Monroe gets a New England lawyer and says, you know, meet with him and let him tell you, because if he tells me, I can't tell anybody. But if you tell me, there's no strings to this. And that's how he learns what's in the details of the Jay Treaty. So there's those sort of things that come back and forth that, you know, I think propel the story about at the same time giving you an either amusing or a, you know, a dramatic sideline to it. Another example, which is just the opposite and is not a humorous situation at all, is during Gabriel's Rebellion, that while Monroe is governor of Virginia and the rebellion is stopped by a thunderstorm and the manhunt begins, Monroe's 1-year-old son is deathly ill. And the thing almost becomes, it's almost like something out of Exodus, out of the Bible, that, you know, he's dealing with this great event and dangerous event and politically charged event, while at the same time he's, you know, in his son's bedroom whenever possible, just to, you know, pray and hope that something miraculous happens to save his son's life, which, as we know, did not. But I think that that's, you know, a nice welding of it, and I'll leave it the best way I think I can answer your question, Sarah, is probably to resort to a historian that I grew up with, Barbara Tuchman. And I remember being 11 and reading The Guns of August, and it was one of the first grown-up books I'd ever read. And she did a scene in that book of a Russian general at the front in his train who is so tall that he keeps banging his head whenever he changes cars. And they had to hang strips of paper down to remind him not to bang his head. And later I heard her talk, and she said that was the important part of the book for me, because it basically was an analogy of how bad things went for Russia. The general can't even, you know, go from car to car in a train without hurting himself. But then the other thing that was in that interview, when she said she was going to be a historian, her professor said, good luck, dear. Just remember one thing, will the reader turn the page? And I've always been a sucker for a book that, like you say, can tell the arc of the story, but at the same time stop and, if not smell the roses, give an aside that adds some flavor to the story and a little bit of depth about the character that you're writing about.
And really the joy of exploration comes through. Your storytelling and the joy of being able to really share these stories about historical figures, Monroe at the center. So I really appreciated that.
Well, thank you. But they write, you know, you just try to, all three of you are terrific writers and understand. But I think with writing history, it's almost get the person's story out there and then get out of the way. There's a delightful letter at the Historical Society in Pennsylvania from Abigail Adams during the War of 1812. And she's writing to Monroe as Secretary of State. And she's basically saying, I'm old, my husband's older, and our son is in Russia. And we would like a chance to see him before we're no longer here. And Monroe, who had extremely difficult relations with John Adams, who was president when Monroe's recalled from France, and Adams calls him the disgraced minister, writes a genuinely wonderful letter back to her and saying, whenever we can get him home, we will, as long as you understand the work he's doing in Europe is so important to what's going on with the war right now and with how we're trying to resolve diplomatic issues with the rest of Europe, that as soon as we can do this, we'll do it. And it's things like that that let you stop and go, look, holy smokes, look at this.
Thanks.
So much of Monroe's career, Tim, was focused on leadership. Some of it at a very early age, as you mentioned, when he was in the Continental Army and took part in one of the more dramatic moments at Trenton, almost at the cost of his life. And then later on, he repeatedly came back to positions of public service that involved leadership, whether it was in Congress or as governor of Virginia, as you mentioned, or as a cabinet secretary, as a diplomat, and ultimately as president. So throughout that, there are these cases where his leadership style, his approach to addressing problems and cutting through them to a result keep coming up. And how did you develop your opinion of him as a leader as you went through the research and writing of your book?
It's another good question, Scott. Thank you. I think the thing that says most about Monroe as a leader is that he paid attention and he listened. I think he was blessed with his uncle, Joseph Jones, who was a seasoned politician, whom everybody in Virginia had a lot of respect for. And just his writings, his letters to Monroe are more a very subtle primer of how to behave, what he thinks he should do, or, you know, advice on this, that, or the other thing. And then the people that Monroe encountered, he writes in his autobiography, the first time he's really paying attention and seeing General Washington on the retreat through Virginia. And it really is a stop the presses paragraph of him beholding this guy who is riding at the end of his troops. So he's in the back where the British will be advancing if they're going to do anything. And he, again, it's a case of paying attention. And then he moves from Washington when he leaves the army to Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson is sort of a lifelong mentor to him. And then he goes with Jefferson, then gets introduced to James Madison. And the relationships with all of them were all very different, but they all work like this in building his approach to leadership. I think he matures when he's trying to work out the navigation rights for the Mississippi. He's, you know, impatient, but he's making his mark with his peers. Another example, I think, of his leadership or his taking advantage of issues is during the ratification convention in Virginia. He's upset that he hasn't been picked to be a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. And I think it's James Madison who basically writes back to him and say, you just got married, you don't have any money, we're not getting paid for this. So stay down in Virginia, make some money. And I'm sure that when we have the ratification convention, you're going to play a major part. And like many, he's desperately wants a new constitution, but when there's no Bill of Rights, now he's again it unless they, you know, move things forward. And again, it's a case of him taking advantage of the opportunity that Patrick Henry gives him, who says, hey, we can make him the poster boy for the anti-federalists here, handsome guy, war hero, on the make. But it's when he makes some of the speeches, particularly when he talks about the Article 2 as far as the chief executive, and he mentions that the president can be tried for high crimes and misdemeanors, but by whom? We don't have all the clear clarifications here yet. And then he's particularly concerned that foreign governments, as he puts it, through their arts and intrigue, might be able to have undue sway either on the president or his advisors from an ocean away. And this is like 200 years before Vladimir Putin and Paul McCartney right back in the USSR. I mean, he sees this as a young man and where things are going with that. So I think that that's a real indication of how he matures as a leader. And of course, you know, we can get into it later, but this most partisan of politicians to then take on Washington's mantle and try to run the country with as little political sway as possible. You know, his story is a roadmap of how he got from, you know, from the early days as an assemblyman and a congressman and a senator to the presidency.
Yeah, am I allowed just to jump on that? Because that's one of the things that fascinates me most, this particular transformation of Monroe from the stridently partisan young man he was in the 1790s to the US president that we see getting to witness the era of good feelings from the White House. And that's one of the biggest transformations. If you're going to look at a little kernel of hope in the world to inspire us right now, certainly, but also just, from how he came. Yes, your Monroe that you present definitely emulates Washington and does so consciously, which is very interesting. But, really, I don't think we see or we could look more at that real contrast between that very unpleasantly partisan young man and the leader who tries to unify and work across party boundaries, or even, get rid of the two parties.
I think the touchstone for that really is when he's made Secretary of State. That's about the time that he starts growing beyond the Jeffersonian Republican agrarian policy approach that he has been. Sometimes he seems to be more of a Jeffersonian Republican than Jefferson. And I think that he's, by that point, taking a look at how he was treated by diplomats when he was abroad. There are a couple of times with this, particularly the French minister, that he kind of delights in a little bit of payback, but that's very rare. But he starts expanding, I think, it becomes a worldview. It goes past party. And especially after Bladensburg and Washington is burned and Madison turns to him and say, can you be Secretary of State and Secretary of War? The measures he takes are almost heresy to a Jeffersonian. We need an established army. The militia approach is not cutting it. We need a national bank because it's the only way we're going to make this, have the money to finance what we need to do. And there's an interesting point later in his presidency where Jefferson's written a letter to Monroe about a couple of policy decisions. And he's not critical, but he's not, kind of going a little too far here. And it's John Quincy Adams, Monroe's Secretary of State, who writes in his diary after Monroe's been telling him this, that sometimes the sea captain gets a little jealous when the first mate starts moving beyond him. And I really think that's what Monroe did. I think he doesn't get near the credit he deserves for his successes, as all of us know. But I think that it's learning as he moves up. And then obviously, as you point out, when he's elected president, it's like, I will adopt Washington's approach. And then what happens after that is just remarkable, especially the first 2 years. It also shows that he became a rather good public relations fellow at the same time, and that he's out of uniform. The revolution is, 40 years ago, but here he is wearing a blue and buff suit and an old-fashioned, chapeau bras, a tricorn, horn hat. And just the newspaper reports of seeing him silhouetted in the, the sunlight or at dusk, and the way the crowds took to him. He's using the past to build the future. And that's really quite an accomplishment for any politician.
According to the sequence we worked out, I would be asking the next question, but I'm going to call an audible and ask Dan Preston if he would like to go ahead with his, just to keep things, nimble.
What if I don't?
Then we have an impasse.
Well, in that case, I better go ahead. You mentioned earlier, Tim, in talking about the arc, you mentioned even him dealing with the crisis of Gabriel's rebellion while he was governor, which brings up the whole issue of slavery. Monroe, as we know, was a slave owner throughout his life, participated readily in the system. He bought slaves, he sold slaves, he mortgaged slaves. He used them as not just labor, but as an economic resource. But at the same time, he thought slavery was, he never used the word moral, but he thought it was a bad thing, thought it was bad for the country, and thought it should be eliminated, not just in the United States, but around the world. Can you say something about this contradiction within him, about his practices as a slaveholder, about what he saw as possible solutions to the problem of slavery and racism in the United States, and how much he was confined in what he wanted to do by the practices and the thought of the time? And was there anything that he was looking at, thinking about, that he saw as a way to move beyond that, beyond the restrictions of the times?
Well, a lot of what I learned about Monroe's viewpoints on the issue of slavery and on enslaved persons, Dan, I got from the essay that you wrote about Monroe and his relationship with the issue of slavery. As you pointed out, he inherited at least one or a couple of slaves when his father died, and Monroe was still a teenager. And he couldn't wait to have an estate, obviously the most famous one being Highland, where Sara is, that based its success and crops and growth and economy on the enslaved persons that he owned. And it's interesting how he's, like so many we talk about, our founding fathers, Washington and Jefferson and Madison and Monroe, who decry the concept of slavery, but still live a rather nice life because of it. Monroe and these governors we were talking about with Gabriel's rebellion, and he's torn with this. He's very aware that the rebellion that Gabriel is hoping to take lead isn't much different than him joining the Continental Army to fight for his own liberty. And when he is compelled to execute the ringleaders of the rebellion, Gabriel, I don't believe, has been captured yet. He writes this heartfelt letter to Jefferson that almost seems to be a combination of Lincoln, Pontius Pilate, and Hamlet, and ends it with, "Where to stay the hand of the executioner," talking about himself. And it's 1800 and Jefferson's running for president, and Jefferson responds that that is the great question. And somewhere in the next paragraph says it should be stopped now because we might wind up losing votes. He doesn't put it that succinctly, but it's easy to see. And when he's in England, he meets with William Wilberforce, who led the anti-slavery movement in the British Empire. I found it as an interesting aside that his approach to the poor English that lived in his district, though that's just the luck of the draw as far as he was concerned. But Monroe has some very engaging conversations and correspondence with Wilberforce. Finally, there's another incident where he represents an enslaved man who was beaten up by one of Thomas Jefferson's nephews. I think he's Thomas Jefferson II or something, and goes to court to get justice for this man, and says the God who made the white man made the black man as well. And as president, his State of the Union messages to Congress, some of the ones he's proudest of, you can tell by the vocabulary he's using, is using the United States Navy to intercept slave traders on international waters and help put an end to the slave trade. So all of this is how he feels until he gets to his property line. And then it's a case of, this is how, an enslaved person is also part of his his assets, his financial assets. And I found it very interesting, as the story goes, that about a year ago at Monticello and at Highland, getting the correspondence back and forth into the papers, Dan, about how he did actually free an enslaved man with the story that he'd never had, and he frees this man on July 4th, which Independence Day, which in 1831, on the day that Monroe dies. So there's just that disconnect, this national disconnect that I'm sure so many Americans would love to go back to to Mount Vernon or to Monticello or to Highland or Montpelier and just say, what were you thinking? You know, if you're, Monroe even writes about, you know, with the Gabriel's Rebellion, should we send some of the rebellious slaves we've captured out to some Western territory? You know, and trying to see if that would work. He's a member of the American Colonization Society, and we all know, and history teaches, that Monrovia is named after him, the capital of Liberia. But I just think he was trapped in his own times and just could not move beyond them.
I think we say could not or would not. In either case, he didn't, and that's the biggest failing, which is, of course, regrettable. And he did not move. And we know that change comes from people who can step beyond the limits of one's time, and he, unfortunately, was not one who did.
Well, we talk about it as a sectional thing often, but, you know, not to make anyone feel like it's more or less that, but when I first came across the papers of Commodore John Barry, here's this, you know, teenage, you know, exile from Ireland that comes to America and makes quite a name for himself, not just as a war hero, but as a successful merchant sailor. And the first thing I'm reading is his will, and on page 2, here is here's what he plans to leave for his 2 enslaved persons, a man and a woman. He will, if his wife has died before he has, they're immediately freed. If not, they will be freed after she dies. And being an Irish American, I'm reading this and going, come on, Jack, really, you too? But that's how systemic it was in his time. You know, the stories about Ben Franklin owned slaves and freed them. There's the only 2 presidents of the first 14 that had no slaves were John Adams and John Quincy Adams. And I think that tells us pretty much where people's mindset was at that time.
One of the things that's emerged too in the last generation of scholarship, say 20, 25 years of the early republic, of people like Monroe, is, I think, a more nuanced, a deeper and more comprehensive understanding of how slavery pervaded so many aspects of American politics in ways that aren't always as apparent unless you read deeper into what the private correspondence is going on between a number of the key figures, what some of the forces involved in positions on slavery or emancipation or colonization have to do with a lot of different related issues, always coming back, obviously, to the core of what is the experience of the enslaved, of the free African Americans. And that interplay is getting much more attention. It's getting much more relevance, certainly, too, in our contemporary debate. And I think that you're coming along with this book at a time that takes advantage of that. And I think the readers will be able to see a little more deeply into what the forces were in Monroe's time and among his contemporaries that were driving a lot of this. And the scholarship that's come along has really helped us bring that out more, I think.
Well, if I could add something as a continuation of that, in looking at Monroe on this, you know, I'm not trying to apologize for what he did, what he should have done, didn't do, but it kind of shows a bit about his personality and the way he functioned. Is he was always looking beyond. All right, we free the slaves. Then what happens? How will they support themselves? Will they become citizens? You know, how will we overcome the ingrained racism of 200 years of slavery to accept the former slaves into American society? Will they become a permanent underclass? You know, do we end up with tenant farming? and peasantry and these sorts of things. What he was saying is we need to think about the repercussions of what we do. And I don't know how much of a chess player he ever was. I remember reading, but he always seems to be thinking a couple of moves ahead, that it's not enough to say, let's free the slaves. Yes, we agree on that. But how do we do it so that it will be beneficial to the freedmen so that they can become economically independent and become truly freed men, freed people with all the rights thereof, and how do we address this? And it's a good question because we still haven't figured it out. You know, this is something we're still wrestling with, and they didn't have to answer them.
I think in Monroe's case, Dan, a lot of information and the ability to bring that up and raise the issue comes from you and Scott and Sarah and what you guys and your staff have done. You know, the papers as you've gotten them, you know, and again, it coincides, I think, with the fact that, you know, maybe we're all maturing about the issue or wanting to know more about it as our country ages. The fact that it's readily available to the volumes to see what Monroe did regarding how he interacted with the enslaved persons he owned. I found it ironic that one of them was Sally Hemings' sister, Tina, who they were enamored with and just thought the world of. And at the same time, as you point out with Monroe saying, well, what are the repercussions, which is typical of his way of thinking. But what Scott's done with displays and pieces that are coming out on the Monroe Museum website, and obviously Sarah's efforts to make sure that the story of the enslaved persons on Highland is equal to Monroe's story. And even the research that some of the staff have done about finding out how some of the enslaved families, his line, you know, if we're going to save them, take them in families, and how many of them wound up down in Florida with the same Africans that had been captured on the Antelope. But yeah, I think it's still very much a learning process, and you can't say we're getting better at it, but I think the awareness of it, especially the fact that it's still obviously ever present in our society today, it's a case of coming to grips with it and judging the times for what they are, and how we can't go back and turn the clock for them. We just have to point out how they reacted, what their thoughts were, and what happened.
So much of the focus, obviously, of our discussion of the book and on history in general has been on Monroe himself. And certainly he was busy in a 50-year plus career in public service that included more jobs in that area than anyone who's ever been elected president before or since. And yet there's also, of course, the people that were important in his life outside of his public role, his family, both the older relatives and his wife and children and other relatives. How did you come to know, and what is your reaction to the family interactions that Monroe had? What did you learn that you didn't know, and what's your overall take?
Plenty there, Scott. You know, there's not a lot of, as you guys know better than me, there's not a lot of documentation as far as his sister Elizabeth, who seems to be a rather remarkable lady in her own right. A lot of Elizabeths in James's family. He certainly spoke well in his autobiography of his father and his mom. His uncle Joseph Jones becomes a surrogate father and a huge influence on molding his career. But Elizabeth is remarkable, and it's again the classic sadness, as with Jefferson with his wife. that their correspondence, Monroe destroyed the correspondence when she died, because she really comes to the fore through third parties. And, you know, this very beautiful New York person in New York society with a wonderful musical talent, and, you know, this regal bearing everyone talks about throughout her life. She's almost like the Jacqueline Kennedy of the founding first ladies. And at the same time, she is incredibly brave. When I was looking to see about digging into doing this book, I love the story of her getting up one morning in Paris. You know, Monroe was hampered by diplomatic restraints, that there's not much he can do on behalf of his friend, the Marquis de Lafayette's wife, Adrienne, who is at Plessis Prison, basically a converted hotel because they'd run out of prison spaces during the Reign of Terror. But her mother and sisters had been beheaded. And Elizabeth gets up one day and has the carriage styled up and dressed in her finest and with food and wine, goes alone to has herself ridden alone to the prison to visit with Adrienne and take the first steps to get her out of prison. And then they get Adrienne Lafayette and their son, George Washington, safely out of the country. And the comments about her being a bit austere or regal, I love them from a couple of Washington socialites that are writing while Monroe is not so secretively running for president, and the dinners he's having with Washington society, how they're bringing back the more formal and classier approach of things than Dolly Madison. I mean, can you imagine following Dolly Madison? I mean, that lady, I love the line, I forget which of the Federalists, who we ran against president, said, I might have beaten James, but I could never beat Dolly. And Elizabeth has that bearing. And she's also has her health issues, but, you know, she doesn't seem to complain about them. No one writes about her griping about if it was rheumatism, arthritis, the different things, epilepsy, ailments that she might have had. And he honestly just loved her to pieces. You know, the fact that he talks about her in his letters with just a really nice warmth. And then you have his daughters, Eliza, who, as you all know, was trained by Madame Campan, who taught the noble ladies in France. And I didn't realize was related to Citizen Genet. Sister. And she, Liza's all too willing a pupil. I mean, she comes out of it almost like an aristo herself. And she's not a very popular lady in Virginia society or Washington, D.C. And yet, at the same time, she's capable of great kindnesses, taking care of one of the Calhoun ladies and young ladies when she's deathly ill. And then Maria is just this sprite that you think of her as the sunshine younger daughter in the 50s and 60s situation comedies, just this really happy-go-lucky soul who is very much a remarkable lady in her own right as well, especially, you know, as she has her own family. And then you come to Monroe's brothers. And, you know, Bill Clinton had Roger Clinton, and Jimmy Carter had Billy Carter. James Monroe has both of them, and Andrew and Joseph. And you wonder sometimes if how many times his eyes looked heavenward and really God, and trying to set them right. Andrew doesn't seem to be near as much of a problem when you compare him to Joseph, who is married, I think, 4 times, and can't hold on to a position no matter what James tries to do, helping him financially or whatever, or with positions, just can't seem to make anything work. And I can't it must have vexed him tremendously to know, how come I learned how to do the right thing and you guys didn't follow up? But it really is a remarkable family, and Elizabeth especially, I'm sure I'm sharing for all of you, it would be wonderful to have had their correspondence and just seeing how much of an influence there was. There's one story I'll leave you with that at the tail end of his presidency, and he's being investigated by Congress for fund, where did funds go to get the White House fixed, remodeled years ago, and so on. And John Quincy Adams talks about the brand new Unitarian Church got a brand new organ, and they're going to have an oratorio recital. And he puts in it in a rather subtle way how surprised he is that James and Elizabeth Monroe show up. And you can almost, getting to know her through third-party correspondence and things, of her saying to him, "We're going. You're the president. We're sitting up front. We're not going to be cowed by what's going on in this town." And I think that's an accurate summation of Elizabeth.
Should we move to audience questions since time is short?
Yes.
That's entire. Yeah, you had the cleanup question, but we may have
Yeah, I can do a lightning round, but let's see if the audience would like to ask questions before I do that. Lindsay, what do we got?
1 second, I'm connecting. I had a little bit of problem with my connection, so we're just going with it. I have a few questions actually, if we're ready for them.
Sure.
The first question comes from Tracy. Tracy asked, for Tim, what is one characteristic of James Monroe that you discovered while researching him that surprised you?
His forbearance. He, both personally and politically, he is very partisan. He can be rather thin-skinned, but a lot of times he holds his temper in check, and then his patience with things. And I think that's best seen in his timing with what we could now call the Monroe Doctrine. He's no sooner elected president when Henry Clay is leading the charge that the South American Republic should be recognized immediately. And Monroe takes his time. He's well into his second term, but he's waiting for everything to work out correctly. He wants to see where things are happening in Europe, post-Napoleonic War Europe. He's trying to assess the stability of the republics themselves. He's constantly sending agents and diplomats and getting input from them. And I think he waits until the time is exactly right. And there's some give and take back and forth whether or not the British government wants to jump in at the same time. And they seem to be playing a bit of games, but Monroe assesses that what we really don't need is the British Parliament's cooperation. We just need the British Navy in the Atlantic. And that's the support we really need. But I think that's one of the great things about him is that he's patient. And again, like I said, his ability to listen. In his cabinet meetings, he's throwing out questions, but he's writing down everybody's answers and encouraging give and take. And it's interesting that two diverse personalities like John Calhoun and John Quincy Adams both said the same thing as did many other people, that he was a man of the best judgment. And I think that shows throughout his presidency.
Okay. We have another question from Mary Kay. She asked, what are key characteristics of his presidency that we can aspire to today? What really stands out that moves through the arc of history?
I think if there are examples he could give a president, it would be what we just discussed about the ability to listen and to think before one speaks. He has a formal politeness, and he's always making people feel at home, but he doesn't say too many things casually. He's a lot like Washington in that regards, I think. But I think that the ability to take your time to make the decision. Everyone talked about the sound decisions that he made on practically every issue. You're hard pressed to come up with some place where he didn't. And if he had to move with alacrity as he did after the burning of Washington, he does. And again, his judgments are smart and sharp there. But I think that's one. I think he shows during the negotiations for the Louisiana Purchase and after Jackson's victory in New Orleans, he shows a willingness to share credit. He might not have approved of how a colleague in the case of the Louisiana Purchase was games playing in the negotiations, but he writes to Jefferson and Madison, give him whatever credit you want. If this is really the President Jefferson's victory, not mine, not his. And when Andrew Jackson wins in New Orleans, Monroe has ordered supplies sent that Jackson doesn't get till after the battle, and Jackson, being Jackson, rails about it in public. And Monroe won't respond because he says there's no use getting into a fight with the hero of the hour. Nobody's going to care about supplies. The war is over. He had a great victory, even if it came after the treaty had been signed. But I think that that's another aspect of him. He's got wisdom and patience.
Do we have one more question? Time for one more question?
Let's do one more.
Okay. Valerie asks, if you had the opportunity to speak to James Monroe, what would you like to say to him?
I would go back to what we spent a good amount of time justifiably with, and just give us your thoughts on why things couldn't move further on the issue of ending slavery. We kind of know the answers, but it would be nice to hear them from him. You know, we can't talk to Jefferson or Washington or Madison or others down there that were slaveholders who signed the Declaration of Independence that all men were created equal. All technically white men, landowners, not all men, certainly not all women. We could go into this and we'll be here till Sunday. I would love to find out his thoughts on why he could do all of these things, but just stop where his property line began.
Okay. Well, that's all for questions for now. Would we like to bring up the book sale?
Yes. What we'd like to again mention is that both Highland and the James Monroe Museum are fortunate enough to have Tim's books available for sale. And again, the option is entirely open to our viewers as to where they would like to purchase it from. No one will object if you buy one or more from each. So that's entirely your choice. But it is important to note that those sales do support the operations of both of our museums, and we're very grateful should you determine to do that. We're grateful to Tim for having written a great book and given us on a new perspective and the benefit of new information and research about James Monroe. Both of our museums look forward, when conditions permit, to have Tim come in person. And so down the road, we'll look forward to that opportunity. And I'm going to call one more audible, and I know Tim would agree, and Sara. We want to commend Dan Preston for his tenure as editor of the Papers of James Monroe on the eve of his retirement, which is coming in just a short time later this month. And we're not doing a party for him, but we do want to give him a hearty thank you and farewell. As I know that we all benefit from what he's done for James Monroe's scholarship.
Amen to that, Scott.
You're here.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to stop the share 1 second, and I'm going to stop the live now.